the dimly lit apartment of the Gutierrez family in Madrid, Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro sat in a circle with her friends, the flickering candlelight barely illuminating the Ouija board between them. It was supposed to be a harmless game, a teenage curiosity fueled by whispers of the supernatural. But when the planchette moved on its own and a sudden gust of wind extinguished the flames, the atmosphere turned icy. Estefania inhaled sharply as a dark mist emerged from the board, twisting and curling into a grotesque shape. Her friend screamed, backing away as the mist lunged toward her, disappearing into her mouth and nostrils. From that night on, she was never the same. Over the next few months, she suffered from violent hallucinations, hearing guttural whispers in the dead of night and seeing shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her room. Her once lively eyes dulled with fear, her body convulsed with unexplained seizures, and she spoke in voices that were not her own. Doctors found no medical explanation. Her parents watched helplessly as Estefania slipped further into madness. She told them of creatures that crawled from the darkness, clawing at her as she slept. Then, one fateful night, she collapsed, gasping for breath. Her body convulsed one last time before going still. At just 18 years old, she was pronounced dead under mysterious circumstances. But the horror didn't die with her. In the days following her burial, the Gutierrez household became a living nightmare. Unseen hands knocked on walls, guttural laughter echoed through the halls, and Estefania's grieving parents swore they could hear her voice calling to them. Her mother woke up to find deep scratches on her arms, as if made by invisible claws. Her father saw her figure standing at the foot of his bed, eyes hollow and staring. Desperate, the family called the police. When officers arrived, they found no intruders but witnessed the terror firsthand. A heavy wooden cabinet door swung open violently, objects hurled themselves across the room, and an unearthly growl reverberated through the apartment. Their official report confirmed unexplained paranormal phenomena, a rarity in law enforcement. To this day, the Vallecas case remains one of the few documented supernatural occurrences recorded by the police, leaving behind a legacy of fear that refuses to fade.
Maria Gomez Camara had lived in her quiet Spanish home for decades. The stone floors of her modest kitchen had withstood years of wear, but nothing could prepare her for what appeared one ordinary morning in August 1971. A face, not a stain, not a simple discoloration, but the unmistakable image of a sorrowful human face embedded within the stone itself. Its hollow eyes stared upward, its expression twisted in anguish. Maria recoiled in horror, calling for her family. But when her husband and son arrived, their blood ran cold. As the days passed, more faces appeared. Some grimaced in pain, others looked frozen in a silent scream. Neighbors flocked to the house, murmuring about restless spirits. A priest was summoned to bless the home, but the faces only grew darker, more defined. When the floor was excavated, workers made a chilling discovery. Human remains buried beneath the house, skulls with cracked foreheads, bones interwoven with ancient chains. The town shuddered at the implication. Was this house built upon a mass grave? Despite the remains being removed and reburied, the faces persisted. They changed over time, shifting expressions and even appearing in different rooms. Paranormal investigators documented their findings, but no scientific explanation could be found. Some claimed it was a hoax, but the faces' sudden appearances and transformations baffled even skeptics. Some who touched the images reported feeling an unbearable sadness, as if absorbing the agony of long-forgotten souls. Even today, the Belmez faces remain an enigma. The house still stands, a relic of Spain's most chilling supernatural mystery.
The Grayson Historical Museum was an unassuming building, known more for its dusty relics than any true excitement. But it held a dark secret, whispered about by the locals. If you stayed in the museum after dark, you would never be seen again. Emma Caldwell, an ambitious journalist, dismissed these rumors as mere small-town superstition. Eager for a story to propel her career, she pitched the idea of spending a night in the museum to her editor, who reluctantly agreed. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and a camera, Emma arrived at the museum just before closing time. The curator, a frail man named Mr. Henley, hesitated when she told him her plan. "Be careful," he said in a trembling voice. "Sometimes history refuses to be silenced." With that cryptic warning, he locked the doors behind her, leaving Emma alone in the vast, shadowy halls. The air inside was thick, the kind of silence that pressed on her ears. The exhibits were innocuous during the day: Victorian dresses, old typewriters, war memorabilia, but under the dim emergency lights, they took on a sinister quality. Hours passed without incident, and Emma began to wonder if she had overestimated the museum's reputation. That was until she approached the Whispers of the Past exhibit, a collection of artifacts retrieved from unexplained disappearances. A child's doll with one missing eye, a locket still stained with blood, a rusted dagger. As Emma inspected the display, she heard it, a faint whisper like a sigh carried on the wind. She froze, her flashlight beam darting across the room. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Emma gripped her flashlight tightly and backed away, but the voices followed her, rising to an unbearable cacophony. Her breath quickened as she realized the whispers were coming from the artifacts themselves. The doll's cracked mouth seemed to move. The locket glinted ominously. The dagger trembled within its glass case. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Emma's flashlight sputtered before dying completely. She fumbled for her phone, but a cold hand brushed against hers. "Leave," a voice hissed directly in her ear. Emma screamed, spinning around, but no one was there. The whispers rose again, now laced with anger. Objects rattled on their shelves, the floor creaked beneath her feet, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Desperate to escape, Emma stumbled toward the entrance, but as she reached the door, she found it locked, despite having the key. She banged on the glass, shouting for help, but the only response was her own panicked reflection. Behind her, the whispers grew deafening, and she turned to see the artifacts moving, rearranging themselves as though alive. The doll was now perched atop the locket, its one eye glowing faintly. The dagger floated, pointing directly at her. Emma screamed as the whispers turned into a roar and the room seemed to fold in on itself. In that instant, she felt herself pulled backward, as if by invisible hands. The next morning, when Mr. Henley arrived to open the museum, he found Emma's belongings neatly placed at the Whispers of the Past exhibit. Her camera was missing, but her notebook remained filled with incoherent scribbles and one chilling phrase repeated over and over: "They are not relics, they are waiting." Emma Caldwell was never seen again, but locals swear they can still hear faint whispers if they pass the museum at night, a chilling reminder of the secrets that should have remained buried. Crestwood Penitentiary had been abandoned for decades, its looming silhouette a reminder of the horrors within. Locals whispered of inhumane punishments, unexplained disappearances, and a warden who vanished without a trace. Despite these rumors, the site attracted urban explorers and thrill seekers. One such group, led by amateur filmmaker Adam Reed, decided to document the prison's infamous underground tunnels for their YouTube channel. The Dark Beneath, they called it. With cameras, flashlights, and equipment, Adam and his 3 friends, Claire, Mike, and Jenny, entered the crumbling structure one evening. The upper levels of the prison were eerie but uneventful. Cells stood empty, their bars rusted and bent. Dust-coated walls bore faded graffiti, and the faint smell of mold lingered in the air. However, when they descended into the basement, an oppressive heaviness settled over them. The entrance to the tunnels was marked by a rusted iron gate. Above it, someone had scrawled in red paint, "Abandon hope, all who enter." Jenny hesitated. "Maybe we shouldn't go down there," she said, but Adam waved her off. The tunnels were pitch black, save for their flashlights. Narrow and damp, the walls seemed to close in the farther they ventured. Faint etchings could be seen in the stone, symbols and phrases in a language none of them recognized. After an hour, the group stumbled upon a chamber. In its center stood a crude altar fashioned from bones and stone. Surrounding it were grotesque statues, seemingly carved from human remains. "This can't be real," Mike whispered. Claire leaned closer to the altar, noticing dried bloodstains and scratch marks, as if someone had clawed at the stone. Before anyone could stop her, she touched the surface. A low, guttural sound echoed through the tunnels. The group froze, their breath catching in their throats. It was faint at first, distant footsteps dragging along the ground. "We need to leave," Jenny said. The footsteps grew louder, the air turned icy, their breath visible. Adam swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing. Then from the corner of the chamber, a shadow shifted. It wasn't human. The creature that emerged was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by darkness. Its movements were jerky, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. When it opened its mouth, a chorus of whispers filled the room, overlapping and indecipherable. Panic set in. The group bolted, retracing their steps through the tunnels. But the passageways seemed to shift, leading them in circles. The creature's whispers followed, growing louder, until they filled every corner of their minds. Jenny was the first to fall behind. Turning back, Adam saw her collapse to her knees, clutching her head. "Leave me," she screamed. Adam hesitated, but Claire pulled him forward. "We can't stop," she shouted. By the time they reached the iron gate, only Adam and Claire remained. Slamming it shut behind them, they collapsed on the cold prison floor, gasping for air. The whispers faded, but their relief was short-lived. When they returned to the surface, they realized something was wrong. The sky was an unnatural gray, the air heavy with silence. The prison seemed different. As they exited, a vast wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction. Adam checked his camera, hoping to make sense of what had happened. But the footage showed nothing but static. The last clear image was of the creature, its shadow stretching toward the lens. To this day, no one knows what happened to Adam, Claire, or the others. Crestwood Penitentiary remains sealed, its tunnels untouched. But locals claim that on quiet nights, faint whispers can still be heard emanating from the ruins, warning all who dare to listen.
It was supposed to be a fun, spooky getaway, a chance for 5 friends to explore a long-abandoned hotel rumored to be haunted. The Crescent Pines Hotel had been closed for decades, its once grand facade now cloaked in ivy and decay. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences, especially the mystery of its missing 13th floor. "I heard they never even built it because of bad luck," Eric said as the group unloaded their gear. "That's just superstition," Liz countered. They planned to capture footage for their paranormal YouTube channel. Inside, the eerie silence was broken only by the occasional creak of its aging structure. Dust-coated chandeliers and rotting carpets hinted at former grandeur. A large, faded portrait of the hotel's original owner, a stern man with piercing eyes, hung crookedly behind the reception desk. Exploring the upper floors revealed nothing unusual. The group joked and laughed nervously, but the atmosphere grew heavier as they climbed higher. By the time they reached the 12th floor, even Liz, the skeptic, admitted something felt off. Then, the long-defunct elevator suddenly powered on with a mechanical groan. The panel inside illuminated, revealing an unmarked button beneath the number 12. "Is that the 13th floor?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the elevator ascended on its own. The air grew colder. When the doors opened, they found themselves in a pristine hallway. Vivid carpets, golden sconces, and a faint melodic tune playing in the distance. "This doesn't make sense," Sophie whispered, clutching her camera tightly. The air felt heavy. Each door bore strange, archaic symbols instead of numbers. Liz tried a knob, but it wouldn't budge. Then a door at the end of the hall creaked open. Inside, a grand piano played by itself, filling the room with a haunting melody. Dust motes danced in the dim light as if suspended in time. "This is insane," Jake muttered. As they turned to leave, the hallway had changed. The walls were cracked and blackened, and a putrid smell filled the air. Shadowy figures emerged from the doors, their whispers growing louder. "Run!" Liz screamed. They raced back to the elevator, but the unmarked button was gone. Eric frantically pressed others. The doors shut just as a shadow lunged forward, its twisted form slamming against the metal. The ride down was violent. The lights flickered erratically. When the doors opened, they were back in the lobby, but it wasn't the same. The chandeliers were gone, replaced by rusted fixtures, dripping with water. The front desk was splintered, and the exit doors were chained shut. The once familiar landscape outside had vanished, replaced by an endless void of swirling gray mist. Sophie clutched her camera, desperately reviewing the footage for answers. But the screen showed only static, interspersed with brief, distorted images of shadowy figures. In one frame, the grand piano loomed, and in another, a shadowed figure stood behind Jake, its skeletal hand reaching toward him. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The shadows in the lobby crept toward them. Liz grabbed a heavy candlestick. "We can't just wait here," she yelled. As they attempted to break through the chains, the whispers grew louder. The shadows closed in. Sophie screamed as something unseen grabbed her wrist, pulling her into the void. The footage was found years later, buried beneath rubble after the Crescent Pines Hotel inexplicably collapsed. Experts claim the tapes were corrupted, but local legend insists that anyone who views them can hear faint whispers calling them to visit the cursed 13th floor.
In the summer of 1967, during the height of the space race, NASA launched the Odyssey Station, an experimental research facility meant to orbit just beyond Earth's atmosphere. Though publicly labeled as a scientific endeavor, declassified documents later hinted that its true purpose was far darker, a covert military experiment involving classified biological research. What followed remains one of the most disturbing, unsolved mysteries in history, buried deep in government vaults. The Odyssey had been operating for 6 months when all contact was suddenly lost. Official reports claimed a technical malfunction, but insiders whispered about a frantic series of distorted transmissions. These were received just hours before the blackout. Static-laden screams, whispers in an unknown language, and a chilling phrase repeated over and over, "It's awake, we can't stop it." These tapes were classified within hours. Months later, the government quietly authorized a recovery mission. A team of 5 elite astronauts, handpicked for their skill in silence, boarded a modified Apollo spacecraft to investigate the station. Led by Commander Jack Reynolds, the team was told nothing beyond restore contact and assess threats. What they found was far worse than they could have prepared for. Upon docking, the Odyssey was eerily intact. From the outside, there were no visible signs of damage. Inside, the air was cold and still, as if the station had been abandoned for years. The crew moved cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the thick shadows of the corridors. Personal belongings were left scattered, half-eaten meals, overturned chairs, and hastily scrawled notes. But there was no sign of the 15 scientists who had once called the Odyssey home. In the control room, engineer Charles Hartley found something chilling, a bloodied handprint smeared across the main console. "Whatever happened here," he muttered, "it wasn't quick." But the most unnerving discovery was in the crew's quarters, where biologist Linda Carter stumbled upon a journal. Its pages were filled with frantic handwriting detailing strange occurrences, unexplainable noises, shadows moving where none should exist, and an increasing sense of dread among the crew. The final entry simply read, "We were wrong, it's not human." As they ventured deeper into the station, the team's radios began to fail. Static overtook their communication, and a low, guttural hum seemed to emanate from the walls. Then they found the containment chamber. The chamber was designed to hold something, a life form. But whatever had been there was gone now. The reinforced glass was shattered from the inside. Around the chamber lay signs of a violent struggle. Blood, torn fabric, and deep claw-like marks etched into the walls. "This wasn't an escape," Reynolds whispered. "This was a massacre." Before they could react, the lights flickered and died, plunging the station into complete darkness. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and a cold, otherworldly voice echoed through the corridors. "You shouldn't have come. What happened next remains classified." Decades later, conspiracy theorists point to documents that suggest the Odyssey recovery team never returned to Earth, or at least not as themselves. NASA denies the mission ever occurred, and any mention of the Odyssey's true fate is met with silence. But some believe the entity that escaped that day never left. They claim to hear the hum in their dreams, growing louder each year. Silent Valley was a place of haunting beauty. Nestled between towering cliffs and ancient forests, it was known for its serene, eerie silence. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed, and the wind never seemed to whisper. Despite its unsettling quiet, locals warned travelers to never venture there after dark. They spoke of unnatural phenomena and the chilling legend of the valley's screams. One late autumn evening, a group of college friends, Emma, Tyler, Mia, and Jake, decided to camp in Silent Valley. They dismissed the legends as mere folklore and sought to prove there was nothing to fear. They reached the valley just before sunset, setting up their camp on a flat clearing near the center. The air was crisp and the silence pressed heavily on them. Even the crunch of leaves beneath their boots felt oddly muted. As the night fell, the friends gathered around the campfire. Laughter and the crackling of flames temporarily broke the oppressive quiet. Mia joked, "Maybe the valley's ghosts are too shy to show themselves." Her laughter echoed briefly before fading into the void. Around midnight, a strange sensation began to settle over the group. The fire dimmed, its flames flickering unnaturally. The air grew colder, and an unshakable feeling of being watched crept over them. Tyler suggested they head to their tents, but as they stood, a distant scream pierced the silence. It was high-pitched, blood-curdling, and utterly human. "Was that a coyote?" Jake stammered, though his voice trembled with disbelief. "No coyote screams like that," Emma whispered, her face pale. The scream came again, closer this time. The friends huddled together, their flashlights darting around the trees, illuminating nothing but shadowy trunks. The air grew heavy with a metallic scent, like blood. Then they saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It had no discernible features, just a tall humanoid shape that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Who's there?" Tyler shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer without taking a single step, gliding unnaturally over the ground. Suddenly, the screaming multiplied. Voices surrounded them, overlapping in agony. Some were pleading, others were shrieking, and some whispered their names. The friends bolted for their car, abandoning their tents and belongings. But as they ran, the valley itself seemed to shift. Paths they had taken earlier now led to dead ends. Trees closed in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Emma tripped and fell, scraping her knees. "Help me," she cried, but when Tyler turned back to help her, she was gone. Only her flashlight remained, spinning on the ground, its beam illuminating a single word carved into the dirt: leave. Panicking, the remaining three sprinted blindly, their breaths ragged. Jake screamed as cold hands gripped his ankles, dragging him into the shadows. His cries were swallowed by the cacophony of ghostly wails. Mia and Tyler finally reached the car, but as they fumbled with the keys, a shadowy figure appeared behind them, its featureless face inches from the window. The next morning, search parties found the campsite, but no sign of the friends. The only evidence left behind was a torn tent, Emma's flashlight, and the word leave etched into the ground. Silent Valley remained as quiet as ever, but locals whispered that the screams had grown louder since that night. In the remote corners of Arizona's Navajo Nation, a place steeped in ancient stories and warnings, the summer of 1996 became the backdrop for a chilling encounter. Rachel and Mike, avid adventurers in their early 20s, had heard whispers of strange happenings in the desert, a place where reality twisted and nothing was as it seemed. Ignoring the warnings of the locals, they decided to spend a night camping in a canyon notorious for its unsettling history. The area was beautiful, yet foreboding, with jagged red rocks that seemed to loom over them as the sun dipped below the horizon. Rachel set up their tent, while Mike gathered firewood. As darkness fell, the desert came alive with a strange energy. Unlike the familiar chirping of crickets or the distant howl of coyotes, there was only a deafening silence, broken occasionally by an unexplainable rustle in the distance. As the couple sat by the campfire, roasting marshmallows, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Do you think there's anyone else out here?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. Mike laughed nervously. "Just us and the stars." But deep down he felt it too, the unnerving sense of another presence. Around midnight, just as the fire began to die, a sound broke through the silence. It was faint at first, like twigs snapping underfoot. Rachel froze, gripping Mike's arm. "Did you hear that?" Mike nodded, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light swept over the rocks and sand until it caught something, a figure standing on the ridge above them. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were long and angular, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It stood perfectly still, watching. "Who's there?" Mike shouted, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it crouched low, its body contorting in ways that defied nature before vanishing into the shadows. Rachel's breathing quickened. "We need to leave," she whispered. But before they could move, a voice echoed through the canyon. "Help me," it was Rachel's voice, trembling and desperate. Mike turned to her in confusion. "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know, but that's not me," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The voice came again, closer this time. It was joined by another, a perfect imitation of Mike calling out from the darkness. "Don't leave me." They scrambled into their tent, zipping it shut and holding their breaths. Something began circling the campsite. They could hear heavy footsteps, and then something brushed against the fabric of the tent. "Let's go to the car," Rachel whispered. Mike nodded, unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the rocks. The figures were gone, but deep footprints surrounded the camp, too large to be human. They sprinted to the car, hearts pounding. As Mike started the engine, the headlights illuminated a figure standing in the road. It looked like Rachel, but its face was hollow, its smile wide and unnaturally stretched. Mike floored the gas, swerving around the figure as it let out a shrill, inhuman scream. When they finally reached safety, the couple vowed never to return, but the encounter left its mark. To this day, Rachel and Mike claim they're not alone. Sometimes, late at night, they hear their own voices calling from the shadows, begging for help. The Navajo elders, when told of the story, offered a grave warning. Once a skinwalker marks you, it never truly lets go. It all started with a simple dare. Spend one night in Blackwood Cemetery and win $500. For Alex, Sarah, Josh, and Emily, the money sounded like an easy prize. Besides, how scary could a graveyard really be? The bet was made, and they crossed through the rusted gates, determined to prove their bravery. The air inside the cemetery felt different, colder, heavier. The moon cast long, eerie shadows across the tombstones, and the sound of their footsteps seemed louder than it should have been. Josh tried to lighten the mood. $500, people. Think of it as a paid camping trip. They laughed nervously and set up their camp near an ancient mausoleum. Its massive stone door was sealed with chains, and the engraving above it was too worn to read. Emily glanced at it uneasily. Why would they lock up a mausoleum? That's kind of creepy. Probably to keep out vandals, Alex replied, though he sounded unsure. As the hours dragged on, they tried to entertain themselves by telling ghost stories, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing minute. A chill crept through the air, and the distant hoot of an owl was the only sound apart from their voices. Then came the first noise, a faint whisper carried on the wind. They all froze. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "It's just the wind," Josh said, though his face had gone pale. But the whispers grew louder, weaving through the graves and calling their names. Sarah, Alex, Emily, Josh. Emily's flashlight flickered as the chains on the mausoleum door rattled violently. She grabbed Alex's arm. "Let's just go," she pleaded. But before anyone could move, the chains fell to the ground with a deafening clang. The heavy door creaked open, revealing pitch-black darkness inside. A soft, eerie melody began to play like a music box coming to life. The group huddled together, too terrified to run. The music stopped abruptly, and out of the mausoleum stepped a figure, a woman in a tattered black dress. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You've disturbed our rest," she said, her voice cold and echoing, "and now you must stay." The ground trembled as skeletal hands burst forth, clawing at their feet. Emily screamed as one hand latched onto her ankle and dragged her into the soil. Alex and Sarah tried to pull her free, but it was too late. She disappeared beneath the earth. "We have to go," Alex shouted, pulling Sarah and Josh toward the gates. But the path had changed. The tombstones had shifted, forming a maze that trapped them inside. The whispers turned into deafening wails. Shadowy figures emerged from the graves, their faces twisted in anguish. Josh tripped and fell against a gravestone. When he looked up, he saw his own name carved into it, along with the night's date. "No, this can't be real," he shouted, but the shadows engulfed him. Alex and Sarah ran desperately, the gate now visible in the distance. But as they reached it, the ghostly woman appeared again, blocking their path. "You cannot leave," she said. "This place is yours now." The ground beneath them cracked open. Alex's last sight was his name on a freshly carved tombstone. By morning, the cemetery was silent once more. The caretaker arrived to find 4 new graves, each marked with the names of the daring souls who sought a $500 prize and paid with their lives.
It was the kind of house people avoided even mentioning. Built in the late 1800s, the once grand mansion now stood in decay, surrounded by a forest that had grown wild and tangled over the years. For decades, no one had lived there, but rumors whispered of its cursed past. Local legends told of a room that didn't exist on any blueprint, a room where unspeakable things happened. Elena, a paranormal investigator hungry for a breakthrough, decided to uncover the truth. Along with her team, Mark, Sarah, and Jason, she entered the house one overcast afternoon. Inside, the air was damp and suffocating, carrying the faint scent of rot. Walls were streaked with black mold, and the floor creaked with every step. But something about the house felt alive, as if it were watching them. "Let's start with the West Wing," Elena suggested, clutching her flashlight. Hours passed, and they found little more than broken furniture and old paintings whose subjects seemed to glare at them. Frustrated, Elena pulled out a journal she had found during her research. It was a diary from the mansion's last owner. It mentioned a forgotten room hidden behind the library. They rushed to the library, where rows of rotting books lined towering shelves. Jason ran his hands along the wall, searching for a seam. "Got it," he said, pushing a loose panel. The wall groaned, and a narrow passage revealed itself. The air beyond was colder, and a faint humming sound filled the corridor. At the end was a door, its surface carved with symbols that none of them recognized. Against her better judgment, Elena turned the handle. Inside, the room was small and empty, save for a single chair and an ornate mirror. The mirror's frame was gilded with strange inscriptions, and its surface shimmered unnaturally. "This is it," Elena whispered, stepping closer. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Mark tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The humming grew louder, almost deafening. Then the mirror began to ripple, as if its surface were made of liquid. A pale hand emerged, followed by an arm, and then a figure that defied reason. A woman with hollow eyes and a smile that stretched too wide. Her voice was a whisper that echoed, "You shouldn't have come here." Panic erupted. Sarah screamed, and Jason tried to smash the mirror with a chair, but it only splintered the wood. The figure stepped fully out of the mirror, her presence draining the light from the room. Shadows seemed to pour from her like smoke, coiling around the group. Elena grabbed the diary and frantically flipped through its pages, searching for answers. A single passage caught her eye. The room
does not let its visitors leave. The mirror holds their souls. The woman lunged at Sarah, her hand passing through her chest. Sarah froze, her face twisted in silent agony before collapsing to the floor. Her reflection appeared in the mirror, screaming silently, banging on the glass. "We have to destroy it," Elena shouted, pulling out a lighter. She set the diary ablaze and hurled it at the mirror. Flames engulfed the frame, and the woman let out a piercing shriek as the room began to tremble. The mirror cracked, and with it the woman vanished. The door flung open and the survivors stumbled out, coughing from the smoke. Behind them, the room collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but a pile of rubble. When they reached the mansion's entrance, the once solid structure seemed to crumble into dust. Elena and her team were the only ones to escape, but they were haunted forever by the face they saw in every mirror afterward, Sarah's reflection begging to be freed.